This episode of Where Did the Road Go is brought to you in part by our Patreons. And this month in particular is being sponsored by Nick Martin. And I thank you so much for your support, Nick. If you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight we have the long-awaited return of Steph Young. Hello, Steph.
Hello.
And you're still getting over being sick.
Yeah, but I'm fine, thank you.
So,
I haven't been long-term sick or anything. I've just had a cold.
yes.
Yeah.
So we're going to... What's the name of the book we're talking about stories from?
People Missing in the Woods.
Do you have any idea what number book this is for you?
No. It's my... There's been quite a few that have come out. So no, I don't actually.
How many?
It's the one before last.
Okay.
Yeah.
Came out this year.
I think it came out. Oh gosh, I can't remember. I think it was maybe October time, something like that.
Okay. The end of last year. Yeah, I guess it's February. Never mind. I guess it wouldn't have come out this year.
Oh yeah.
I have no concept of time.
No, nor do I. Which is good.
But I expect a book from you about every other month, so.
Yeah.
We're gonna go over some of these particularly weird stories in this book, and we're gonna start with Into the Bayou.
Yeah, I always don't know if it's Bayou or Bio, but
Bayou.
Is it Bayou?
Bayou.
Okay. Well, it's a strange tale of a man's disappearance in a bayou involving a hitman in a Cadillac, an Elvis impersonator, a home invasion by a very calm burglar, and silver elves, but it's still unsolved.
Yeah, this one's weird.
It is really weird, isn't it? So in December 1998, 23-year-old Matthew David Prendergast was in the last semester at Rhodes College, Tennessee, and on the morning he disappeared, he'd been due at class, a distance of about 4 blocks away from his apartment, and he left his apartment, but he didn't arrive at class, and he's never been seen since. On the day that he disappeared, his Toyota vehicle was found abandoned on a private levee near Bayou Meta Swamp, which is off, for those who would know it, off Kerr Road in Lanark County, Arkansas. Oh, hold on, Arkansas, isn't it?
Yes, it's Arkansas.
Yeah, I can't believe that you pronounce it like that. The area was a private land reserved for duck hunters, and one hunter found the vehicle, a man called Joe Muddle. He told Matthew's mother, Mary Ellen, that he and a friend had seen her son's vehicle parked up there at about 2 p.m. that day, but it hadn't been there when they'd gone past at 10 a.m. And that afternoon, they had left a note on the windshield asking for the owner of the vehicle to move it, but the next day it was still there. So then they thought they would take a look inside, and they found that it was unlocked, and the keys were in the ignition. And in the glove compartment, they found an old oil change receipt that had his parents' phone number on, so they phoned his parents. The vehicle also had his backpack in that he used for college. Well, when the authorities got involved in looking for him, they searched around the car, and this was the day after, and they found his wallet containing his driver's license, credit card, cash in his jeans pocket. But his jeans were located 100 yards from the abandoned vehicle in a really thick wood. His clothes were also found in the woods there in a neat pile, and his blue jeans and a t-shirt, as well as his shoes and socks, but no sign of him. So he seemed to have driven 125 miles, come off the highway, and ended up in this swamp. And then it appeared he'd taken his shoes off, all his clothes off, and vanished. well, going through the newspaper reports and the police reports, his trousers were wet from the knees down, and they said it looked as though he'd just stepped out of them and dropped them to the floor where he stood, and these were in this thick area of woods. But his trousers were soaking, but his t-shirt was as dry, the policeman said, as if it had come out of the dryer. But it was cold and there was no jacket there. Well, he had last been seen in his apartment about 7:30. The landlady had heard him moving around, and the previous evening before he vanished, he had been talking on the phone with a friend, talking about a college paper. The friend was called Geo Presley Brooks, but he's not the Elvis impersonator. But so his friend said, well, he was really upbeat, and we were talking about what to do for this college paper. The next morning, he sent a text to this friend, said, everything's all right, no problem, I'll talk to you later. So you could think, well, is there something in that message, about what happened to him or what he was planning? But sorry, it could also mean that maybe he was just talking about he'd resolved in his mind overnight what he was going to do for the college paper. Mm-hmm. Well, the background of Matthew was that he was well liked. He played in the soccer team. He wrestled. He liked to play tennis, run track, cross country, and he was in the Kappa Sigma fraternity. But when he wasn't doing all of those social things, he really liked playing a multi-user Dungeons and Dragons game called Threshold RPG. Mm-hmm. Well, so if we go back to when the search for him was conducted, the security checked, obviously sent an email out to all the students, or a text bulletin thing. In the area that he'd disappeared, they had helicopters, they had divers with sonar, bloodhounds, and then they got the cadaver dogs in. And the canine picked up the young man's scent from the pile of clothes in the woods to the edge of the bayou. And the search focused really on the thick woods and the water. It's actually a wildlife place there, quite extensive rivers that run through it. But his mother said, well, he was never known to be a hiker or a camper, and they couldn't understand why he would go there. Well, his scent was picked up from the pile of clothes to the edge of the bayou, but the dogs found no scent to follow from his vehicle to where his clothes were found, and there were also no footprints. So how did he get from the vehicle to where he stripped off his clothes in the woods? And the investigators also found no sign of a struggle, no weapons, and no DNA. So it doesn't seem possible that he could have got from the vehicle to the woods without any DNA even. The tracker dogs could only pick intermittently up on his scent. And when his clothing was found, his mother said, well, they were piled neatly, and my son wasn't a neat boy. And she said, his college room was a mess. And one thing I thought was, well, it's really common when people kill themselves in water, like in the UK quite often, it's really sad, but people go to the beach and go in the sea there, and they almost always take their clothes off and pile them neatly. So I don't know why, but it's a common thing to do. But they didn't think he had any reason to. He'd been in a play the night before. He was planning a paper. He had his future planned with what job he was going to do, and they said he wasn't depressed. So he was going to start a third world non-profit organisation thing after college. So he really knew what he wanted to do. But one clue led them to think maybe he was trying to kill himself, because when he was playing this Dungeons and Dragons game, there was a link on that game, I guess I've never played games, but I guess on the actual website, or would it be in the messages? Well, there was a link to this website, and at the same time, when they discovered his backpack in the car, they'd found a journal that he'd written in, and it actually contained poetry, and the poems were contemplations on nature and death, and some of them mentioned these silver elves. So he wrote about silver elves and seeking immortality, and he wrote about walking into the water and becoming one with nature again. So was he being literal, or you know. Well, when you go on that link, the Silver Elves do have a website, and they call themselves, these elves are, it's something to do with the Elven Tree of Life and Death. So the website explains it. They say, we're a family of elves who've been living and sharing the Elven way since 1975. And if you choose, you can go on a journey. The Elven Tree of Life Eternal, known to man as the Tree of Life and Death, reveals the pathway to fairy and the means to obtaining immortality, which some seem to think is the doom of the elves, even while they hunger after it. And they say, the journey begins here. We start here at the bottom of the tree, the ever-present now. This is the place symbolized by the cross, time, space, eternity circle. But they offer you the chance to discover if you're an elf, a fairy, or an otherkin. And they say the elfin is like a secret garden in the midst of the wild and potentially dangerous realm of the fairy. You're perfectly safe in elfin, but it may take a great deal of courage to pass through fairy to get there. And this reminds me of the case of Nettie Fornario, who went to the island of Iona. This was back in the time when Aleister Crowley first went into his order and used to fight with Samuel Mathers, apparently. And then Nettie went off to this island in Iona because she wanted to communicate with the fairies, because she was obsessed with an opera. This writer that she had an obsession with wrote an opera about the fairies, and she wanted to go to this island, which she did, and she disappeared, and they found her on the moors, and they couldn't work out how she died because her toes were scratched, but the rest of her feet weren't, and she was barefoot.
Yeah, that's a weird story too.
Yeah, I won't go on about that one, but it is, isn't it? So anyway, so Matthew, well, his friend said, look, that was just poetry. That was just his way of expressing himself. He didn't want to kill himself. But then there was a psychic who has actually contacted the Lanark County Sheriff's Department, a lady called Carol Pate, and she said that, in her opinion, he had taken his clothes off and stepped out into the bayou where he died of hypothermia. But she said he didn't drown himself. He just simply lay down in the mud to die. But his mother said, well, he would never do that. So then it goes on, and the police were looking into it all, but they couldn't understand what happened, and a private investigator was hired by the family as well. And nobody could sort of work out what would have been the reason for him to disappear. There was no ransom note or anything. But this private detective called Jim Calusa, he said that he was driving to the area, and he came across this Cadillac that was stopped not far from where Matthew had disappeared, and there was a man standing there, and he was holding a gas can. And when the investigator went up to speak to him, he said that the man was shaking so much, and he thought, well, maybe because it's cold, but he thought maybe he's got something to hide. Anyway, he let them go on. Well, the same day, the Cadillac returned. The investigator had gone, but the Cadillac came back, and this woman who lived in a house nearby had come back from grocery shopping, and she went in her house and she saw this man on the home phone talking to someone. And the man on the phone talking to this other person said to the lady, I won't be a moment, and finished his conversation, and then kind of thanked her and just left. And it turned out that he was phoning somebody who lived in Atlanta, who happened to be somebody that Matthew knew. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of investigation about, according to the private eye, saying, well, what are the chances, that Matthew has a friend in Atlanta, a big city like that, and then they just happen to be talking to this man in a Cadillac. So that goes on quite a bit. But they couldn't. The mother and the father said that they kind of believed that maybe there was a connection here and something had been going on criminally. Maybe it had been drug dealing. Maybe Matthew had got in too deep. He wasn't involved in it, but maybe a friend at college had said, look, could you just meet up with these guys? And, so maybe they had, well, the private eye thought maybe they were bringing the body back, or maybe they were taking it away. but the police looked into it actually after the private eye had said, this is what's happened, and they couldn't find any records of the phone calls that the private eye said his friends had made, so they couldn't find proof that this had actually happened. And it goes on and on. There are all these strange kind of directions that it goes in, but ultimately there's no real answer about what happened to him, or there's no real answer about it.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, if he had just laid down in the water to die, you'd think they would have found him.
They would. I mean, I looked on the maps, and those rivers go a long way. In fact, they go into other states, from what I could make out. But he wouldn't have got that far, I wouldn't have thought.
No.
And I mean, the most rational answer is that somebody carjacked him, or somebody somehow got hold of him, and they carried him to the woods. Maybe.
I mean, it doesn't seem beyond belief that he could have been attempting some kind of ritual and maybe got hypothermia or something.
But then where's his body?
Yeah, well, it would have had to gotten washed down somewhere, and you think they would have found it,
They would have found it.
I mean, because there is sort of a thing to that where, maybe he was trying to figure out what, if he had some kind of special ability or whatever, and was using the cold water to induce an altered state, not trying to kill himself per se.
Yeah.
And of course, parents are always going to say, well, my son wouldn't do that. So when the parents say something like that, it's kind of like, well, yeah, sometimes. There was a case recently I heard about where apparently this kid may have been Germany or something, but he disappeared. And they found him just recently. It's been like 20 years. And, there was a huge search for him when he disappeared. He just, gone one night. Mm-hmm. And the parents were like, this is not like him. He wouldn't just leave. Well, it turned out he just left. He wasn't happy at home, and he just walked off and went to like France or something. And started a whole new life and never contacted anyone from his past. So I think
he could have gone to Himalaya.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the parents aren't always the best judge of what their children are capable of. I mean, it depends on the parents, how close the parents really are, and how well they actually know their kids. So whenever I hear someone say, well, my kid wouldn't do that, it's like, how many times you hear that when the kid's done that,
Yeah.
And the wet pants too kind of make it sound like he might have walked into the stream and went, I shouldn't do this with my clothes on, and got back out and took the pants off and stuff.
But it still doesn't explain how they couldn't pick up his scent from the car to the woods. Yeah. Although one case, and I think it was Stacey Arias actually, I was looking at recently, and one of the search people involved in that case had specifically said, if the wind is blowing a little bit, it mucks around with you being able to follow the direction of the scent.
In having talked now to a couple people who have trained dogs like that, apparently it a lot of times they're not that reliable. If they do pick up a scent, they're very good with it, but the chances of them picking up a scent isn't always that good. If there's a lot of wind, if there's bad weather, if there's been a lot of other things through the
dusty
area. Yeah.
That was it I read as well recently. If it's very dusty and dry, I don't know why, but yeah.
So they're not something that's 100% reliable. It's one of those things where you could say, okay, let's try the dogs, because if the dogs can find a scent, that's great. But it's not it doesn't mean anything if they can't, I guess is what I'm saying. Because there's a lot of different reasons why the dog may not pick up the scent, including the fact that the dog may not be very good at it.
May not be very well that day.
That too.
Have a cold.
The guy with the gas can is just bizarre.
Yeah, I know.
To just walk into someone's house calmly and use their phone, and then, I mean, I guess that's the best reaction if you're in someone's house and you're not robbing it. To remain calm and just be like, okay, I gotta go.
That poor woman, her mouth must have hit the floor. Her jaw must have been.
Oh yeah, I'm sure she had a heart attack.
He's gonna kill me. I know, but he was apparently so calm and collected.
So I mean, maybe that's why. But him shaking on the side of the road with a gas can, I'm thinking that would raise some red flags to me.
I know. It's a shame that it happened quite a long time ago, because I'd love to do, a like on the ground investigation of that, or some of these other cases that happened a long time ago. And there's so many, because another part of it was that I think it was one of the cops said that they had identified a group of people who were responsible for this and other disappearances, and the information had gone to the police. But I don't know who these people were. And in fact, the police kind of said, well, yeah, but they're all dead now, or half of them are dead. So it didn't go anywhere. But why would a group be doing it?
Yeah, well, I mean, you never know. People do bad things, especially in groups sometimes.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's easier to hide in groups, too.
Yeah.
Because you're working with more than one person, so... All right.
I think it's maybe like a family, intergenerational.
It could be.
Keep secrets.
It's unfortunate, but there are some really unpleasant people in this world who do some really horrible things. And I think most of us can't conceive of people doing that stuff because we would never do it.
Yeah, I'd never listened to the news because I think news is too depressing in real life. But there's just been a case of a little girl on an island off England that was just snatched out of her, I think it was snatched out of her bed, and they've just caught the person who did it. A 16-year-old boy did it and just took her into the woods and killed her.
Wow.
I mean, it's probably a very tiny, I don't know enough about the island, but it's probably a very, not heavily populated, so they would all know each other. And yeah, and I was just thinking that when I heard the actual headline, I thought, oh my God, these things really do happen. You pretend they don't, but they do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
or you see, there's popular detective shows where they have these really dark crimes on them. Again, I don't watch because it's kind of depressing, but you think, oh, well, that probably doesn't really happen, and then you hear it on the news, and you think, okay, it's still, it does happen.
So kind of depressing, says the person writing books on this stuff.
Well, yeah, but I find it more of I find it stimulating, because you just hunger to know what could have happened or why. Yeah. I find the ingredients of it more fascinating. I don't see it as a doc. I see it as a story. That's how I can do it without thinking, oh, that's so awful. Because otherwise you'd get upset, wouldn't you, if you did it every time? So you have to look at it as a study, as something to research. But
right. All right, let's move on to Steve Brodie's strange encounter.
Steve Brodie. Oh yes. Well, when I did one of my first books, I'd come across. There was a magazine that used to be out in America called Amazing Stories, and I don't know when it stopped producing, but somebody had, in fact, actually, somebody who got in contact with the editor, had mentioned this race called the Deros, and it was a really, really scary story. And then recently I found this other one, which ties into it kind of, because Steve Brodie was an artist and a rock collector back in the 1930s. And so he and a friend one day decided they would go up to the Superstition Mountains to look for quartz crystal. And they'd heard, because that is a place where gold miners used to be found beheaded, and they had an idea that people used to disappear, there, but they thought, well, we're going to go anyway. And he said that immediately they got there, and they got to a particular bluff where they believed they would find the best crystals, but as soon as they got there, he said a hooded figure came out from the shadow of the rocks, and they both froze in shock, obviously, and the shrouded figure raised an arm and pointed a long device at Brodie's friend, who appeared to fall on the floor, and it looked really like he was dead. And the hooded figure then came towards Brodie, who was standing still, and placed some kind of device over his head, like a metal helmet, with 2 discs that covered either side of his temple. Brodie then believes that he lost consciousness, and the next thing he knew, he woke up in an underground dungeon, which he thought was a cave, and all around him were other humans being held prisoner. And they all appeared to be in some kind of trance, which he said veered from comatose to slightly awake. And he said that on one occasion or two he could rouse himself a bit, and he managed to communicate with one of the female prisoners, and he said, "Where are we?" And all she could say was, "We're being held captive by the Darrow," but she couldn't say where they were. And then his recollection of being in the underground prison is quite scant, but so he couldn't really describe more. And he said the next thing he could actually describe was finding himself wandering the streets of New York City with absolutely no idea how he got there. And when he finally made it back home, then he began to paint, but everything he painted was being influenced by what he'd seen when he'd been down there, or rather more, it was kind of futuristic landscapes and a style that he'd never painted before, really. I don't think he painted the dungeons. I think he painted landscapes that looked like from another world. And it was at this time that he got into a conversation with a neighbour of his who happened to be a UFO researcher. And he was in this UFO researcher's apartment called Robinson when he suddenly saw one of these amazing story magazines on his table, and he said, "Oh my god, somebody else speaks of the Darrow," because it happened to be that this Darrow story was on the front page. And it was then that he said to Robinson, you know, about what happened to him in the Superstition Mountains and finding himself in New York 20 years, it was actually 20 years earlier. But Robinson then said that after he told him, this once quite relaxed artist now began to exhibit extreme paranoia, and he frequently said that he believed he was being followed and watched. They only really saw each other a couple more times when he disappeared, the man who'd seen the Darrow. And none of the neighbours knew where he'd gone, apart from one neighbour who said that he believed that he'd seen him in the Arizona desert wandering like a zombie, and that was it.
And what year did this take place?
That was in the... Well, hold on. That was... it was 1930 when he had the experience, okay. But when he was talking to Robinson, it was 20 years, so it was the 50s.
All right, yeah. Because I was going to say, I think the Darrow thing was in the probably 1940s, somewhere in that range.
Okay. Oh, okay. Well, so... Okay, well, he said... Oh, okay. So...
Ray Palmer published it in the 1940s, so... Okay,
so he said it happened to him in the 30s, but then when he was talking about... When he saw the magazine cover, it was the 50s.
Okay, all right.
So I guess that would work.
It's interesting. There's other stuff that's happened at the Superstition Mountains, too. I mean, that's one of those hotbeds of weird encounters.
Is it?
Yeah, well, I think that's where it gets its name.
I've only really heard of the... I did find a reptilian one recently, actually. I think it was in the Superstitions. But I've only really associated it with the miners that kept being found. Do you know any, Seriah?
Not off the top of my head,
no. Okay. No, me neither. I can not offhand.
But generally, when some place has a name like that, there's a reason for it. But you said miners were found?
Yeah, they were. They kept being found beheaded. Lots of them. You can find it online, actually. If you just put it in, you would find a kind of timeline of it, because people were going there prospecting, and they were all being found dead over the years as years passed on. And I don't know, but a lot of them were being found without their heads. So I don't know. Some were shot. Some were just found dead. I
just in Wikipedia it says some Apaches believe that the hole leading down to the lower world or hell is located in the Superstition Mountains, and winds really? Blowing from the hole are supposed to be the cause of severe dust storms in the metropolitan region.
Oh, I've stayed quite close to the mountain, actually.
Really?
Yeah, I did. In what year was it? About 8 years ago. Yeah, and there was a really big dust storm, I remember. Although this is really silly, but I didn't actually know that I'd been in the Tonto National Forest. I didn't know I was in it. I knew I was somewhere, but no, it's not like I vanished enough to know where I was. I mean, I was staying over there. We went through the Painted Valley. We were going to a reservation and it was about a 6 hours drive from Scottsdale, Arizona. And we stopped and we took a walk in this wooded area, which I didn't realise at the time was Tonto National Forest that I was in. But this was before I started writing.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. What was our next one? Oh, Colonel Shaw's Encounter with Aliens.
I really like this one. So when was this? Give me a moment. Oh, this was in the late 1896. This was when the Stockton Evening Mail of California published the account, and it came from a Colonel, H.G. Shaw. Well, he only came forward because he was with somebody else who could say he wasn't crazy for saying it. What happened was that they were in a horse and carriage travelling along a country road near Lodi, County, California. He was with a friend called Mr. Camille Spooner, and they suddenly found themselves being harassed by what they called three tall, thin humanoids who attempted to kidnap them. The Colonel said that fortunately they successfully managed to fight them off, and the newspaper said that these were possibly from Mars. They said the gentleman was very reticent to describe what happened, but he did go on and say. So he said the horse suddenly stopped and gave a snort of terror, and then we beheld these three strange beings. He said they resembled humans in many respects, but they were like nothing we'd ever seen before. And he said that they refused to, they said that the group of beings were at least 7 feet tall, but he said that they weighed less than an ounce. And the reason he knows this is because he attempted to lift one of them, because they tried to kidnap him and his friend, and then the Colonel, I presume, tried to kind of retaliate, and the beings couldn't lift him and his friend up, but the Colonel could lift the beings up. He said they less than 1 ounce. Is that less than a bag of sugar? They were communicating, he said, with each other with warbling sounds like, he said, a monotonous chant that was guttural. He said their feet were really long and narrow, and their toes were as long as their fingers. They had no clothes on, and he said their skin was like as soft as silk. He said they had no hair, their ears were tiny, and their noses were like polished ivory, he said. Their eyes were very large, and he said it seemed to me that they didn't have any teeth. He said, well, basically, he said, I asked where they were from. They didn't seem to understand me. Their remarks were instead addressed to each other, warbling to each other, and they seemed to really try and kidnap the two men, but they just didn't have the strength. And then, in the end, he said that they had nozzle things that they could put in their mouths from an attachment that they had, and he said it sounded like escaping gas, like blowing up a football, and they held this device thing in their hand, and that's how he believed they were alive, by ingesting this air of some sort, gas of some sort. But he also said, I don't want you to think that these were hideous creatures. He said they were absolutely indescribably beautiful and graceful, and more divinely beautiful than anything I've ever seen. And then they got in this kind of like an airship. He said they got into this, about 150 feet away, they got into this large airship that had some kind of rudder, but no visible machinery. He said when they walked to the airship, they were swaying, and their feet only touched the ground at intervals, so almost like they were sort of, I guess gliding, but just touching down and bouncing back off. And then after that, there were lots of reports after that of these strange airships in the sky. So you could think, well, okay, this is when they were building airships, but they couldn't have been human if they couldn't have actually been real humans. Like sometimes I think the MyLab things, okay, well they're humans doing it, dressing up. But you couldn't say that about these. I can't think they'd have been. I mean, it was what, 100 odd years ago. So you couldn't think they would be holograms or something. What would they have been?
Well, I think they fall into the same category as whatever these things are in general. It's like the perfect example of a weird encounter with very high strangeness, like stuff that just doesn't quite make sense. And it may be part altered state of consciousness, part something else.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, but then I suppose you say, well, but hold on, but they both saw it, or it both happened to them? Or...
No, I think there was probably something actually there.
Oh.
It's just that whatever form it took, they kind of put the form on it. Right. They more or less created the form for the thing. And I mean, obviously, it doesn't sound like a real creature could be the way that these things were, which puts it in that high strangeness category. Yeah,
they didn't sort of seem like a cryptid type thing. No, not at all. More ghostly.
Yeah, but they still had a physical form that can interact with them.
Yeah.
And those are the ones I find really interesting when you get those kind of cases.
I love these kind of accounts.
And what was the year on that one?
Didn't I say 1896, I believe I said.
So right in the middle of the airship wave. Some of which were probably actual airships, some were probably hoaxes, and there may have been some genuine anomalies in there, and that's what that sounds like right there. If that was a real story from this person, that's, that seems like a really odd incident.
Yeah.
To say the least.
It's actually I love the way it's written actually in the newspaper, because in the old days they used such rich language when they were writing these accounts. They were so dramatic, and the vocabulary was so descriptive, the way they would, better than newspapers are written now.
Oh yeah. What newspapers are left, that is.
Yeah, well.
All right.
Shall I say about the other account, the one that Mr. Bozak had?
Sure.
Well, I put it in the book next to it, really, because I find it really weird. It was in 1974, though, so more contemporary, but a Mr. William Bozak of Frederick, Wisconsin. Again, this was in a newspaper, and it was really good to read, and they described it as a hair-raising experience. He was driving home to his rural dairy farm where he'd lived for over 30 years. He was coming back from a farmer's meeting when he suddenly saw this strange object on the roadside, and as he got closer to it, he couldn't find an explanation at all, and he would later tell the newspapers that it was a human being standing inside a bullet-shaped transparent glass compartment. He said the figure inside the glass compartment was between 8 and 10 feet in height, and his arms were raised above his head. He said the man's ears were higher on his head than was normal. And he said the figure was wearing a tight-fitting suit, but had a furry upper body. He said he was looking out of the window, and these are the words he used. He said it was a different kind of character than you'd see on this earth. It looked a good deal like a man, but it had a different looking face. It had a kind of cow looking face, and his ears were shaped like cow's ears too. He said the being had no collar or shirt, but did appear to be dressed. And as he drove away from the creature in the glass tank, he said his car got dark and he heard a noise like the engine was missing from his car. Investigator Everett Leitner back then reported that Mr. Bozak said that although he was very frightened, he said the look on the alien's face looked as scared as he was, and Mr. Bozak said he could tell by its large eyes protruding from its head. And then, though, he said, though he was terrified, he really regretted leaving. And Mr. Bozak said, I should have stopped and tried to show it I was friendly. I wish I could meet up with it again.
Wow.
Yeah.
And again, you said it had a fairy-like body, he said?
Furry. Like a furry teddy bear. Like a furry cow.
Oh, okay.
Fur, like, an animal. Yeah, sorry, yeah, my pronunciation. Not fairy, furry.
Gotcha.
So it was like a cow. It was like a furry cow, but also like a man. Half and half.
Yeah. And again, I love those type of stories there, because they're not the thing you'd think someone would make up.
No, they're not. I mean, I know he works on a farm, but you wouldn't drive along and think that's a half man, half furry creature in a
Right.
glass compartment standing upright, staring at me.
Huh.
Hmm.
Now, the next one I think you had was a fairy abduction. That was David Williams.
Oh, I forgot about that one.
Yeah, that one goes back to quite a ways.
Okay, let me just remember. Right, that one's from that one is from 1887 in Wales, and it was recorded by the Reverend Elias Owen. The Reverend recorded details of David Williams, who was actually the manservant of his mother. And this manservant was used to accompanying the Reverend's mother, who was a widow, home from her travels when she went to visit neighbours and friends. And this particular evening, he was walking her back home from an evening at her friend's house, in the distant village somewhere. And he would always walk behind her, obviously deferentially. So he had a big slab of pork on his shoulder. He was called Big David on the account of him being really tall and sturdy and strong. So he was walking behind her, and the Reverend's mother said she didn't keep glancing behind to see if he was there, because they routinely did this and she wouldn't think to look. Well, she got back home and turned to actually say thank you for escorting me, but he had disappeared. And so she didn't go to bed. She sat up in her chair waiting to see where he was. And it wasn't until 3 hours later that he arrived back home, still carrying the slab of pork on his shoulder. And she said to him, "Where have you been?" And he said, "Well, I've just been right behind you." And she said, "You need to tell me the truth." And he said, "I was here all the time." Anyway, eventually he did explain to her what happened. And really, if you think about it, he took a risk in saying it, because servants in those days really had to, keep their employment, or they would go to the workhouse and die of starvation. So to say something crazy happened to him would be a real risk. But he did. He said, "I was walking behind you, and suddenly in the sky I see this meteor flying, and behind the meteor is a hoop of fire with a tiny man and a tiny woman standing inside of it. And they started to descend, and they were holding on to each other, and both had hold of the hoop of fire. Then they descended into the field, and when it touched the ground, two little people jumped out of the hoop, began to create a circle in the field, and started dancing. And all these other little tiny fairies, out of nowhere, enter the circle, and the music begins, and they're all dancing. And the manservant is just entranced, and he can't do anything but watch. At some point later, the meteor returns. It scoops up the little woman, and takes them back off up into the sky. And then the manservant obviously made his way back to the widow's house, and he thought he thought he was just maybe 1 minute behind her, but 3 hours had passed by.
And that is such a typical sounding fairy story.
Yeah.
If Josh was in on this call, he could pick out all the elements and tell us everything about them.
Uh-oh. That's good.
But yeah, that is, yeah, again, not something the guy would necessarily want to make up.
No, because you had to keep your job in those days, didn't you? I mean, if
Yeah.
you weren't one of the landed gentry, then that's it for you. You would just die of starvation and poverty. So you had to, you couldn't say something crazy like that. Although he did.
Well,
Probably because he was so stunned and shocked, he had to tell someone,
yeah. And with a lot of this stuff, I don't think they're seeing what they think they're seeing. I think it's just how it's presenting itself to them, almost like a show.
I wonder what happened in the 3 hours that he was there.
Yeah,
Because he didn't return for 3 hours.
If it was even 3 hours, maybe time worked a little different there.
Maybe she got. Yeah, well, maybe. Yeah.
So, all right. So the next one is a poltergeist abduction.
Oh, is this Jacob?
Yes, Jacob Mutton.
Jacob Mutton. Yeah, I actually found this through a man who is a retired police commander called Brian Langston, and he had discovered this story of it's a long forgotten pamphlet that was lying in a corner of the reading room of the British Library, but it's a 17th century story, and it's of a young man in North Cornwall, south of England, who apparently mysteriously teleported 30 miles from his home by an unknown sort of force. The boy was called Jacob Mutton, and he was a servant employed by a rector of Cardinham called William Hicks, and they lived on Bodmin Moor, which is a really rugged area of natural beauty. But it's very harsh, beautiful but harsh. Well, the servant boy was known to be a hard-working boy, never in trouble, and the event happened on Sunday the 8th of May, 1687. It was after 8 p.m. and he'd taken himself off to bed. He shared the bedroom with another servant boy, but that boy was already in bed, and Jacob later would explain that as he began to get undressed for bed, he began to hear a voice, which he described as hollow, and this voice was saying, "Soho, Soho, H-O-E." And it sounded as though the voice was coming from a nearby room, so he went off to investigate, but in this room he could hear the voice again, but now it was coming from outside the window. So he peered out the windows, and he could see nothing outside, and the last memory he had was of watching out the window until the following morning, when he was found lying unconscious in a countryside lane by a group of people travelling to a market at a fair. So they tried to rouse him, and he appeared really baffled about what he was doing lying in a country lane in a spot that he didn't recognise, and it turned out he was 30 miles away from home. Well, the group who were going to the fair couldn't just leave him there on his own, so they took him with them, and once the fair was over, the group set him off on the right road to make his way back home, which was now a distance of 20 miles from the fair. And fortunately on that road, he was eventually discovered by other travellers, and they took him to spend the night with them. The next morning, he continued on foot alone, and eventually he makes it back to the rectory. And he didn't appear any worse physically, but the rector said his demeanour had changed. He said the boy was very quiet, and he appeared really sad, and that was not the usual behaviour of this boy. But then he had just walked 30 miles, I thought. But the rector says that, no, this continued on. He was changed. And all he could really say was that a tall man had taken him over hedges without any hurt or any harm to him. But he couldn't say what happened to the tall man.
I don't know if that sounds as much like that. That actually has fairy elements to it as well.
I came across, there's an anthropologist, I believe her name's Carmen Blacker, I think, and she's written some she's collected accounts that were given to her in Japan, and there are quite a few accounts very, very similar to this one, and it's always a tall man that takes them, and they fly over mountains, over rooftops, and it's always a tall man. And in those accounts in Japan, quite often it's actually monks that have to go and get the boy back.
That's interesting. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Carmen Blacker, an anthropologist. Yeah, very, very good account, very interesting to read. And I came in some of my books that I've done since I've been on your show in the last couple of years. I've come across some poltergeist ones. There's a really good case in Sandfeld in Germany of a boy that was being abducted by some kind of poltergeist, and the account was actually written down with all the different witnesses by the owner of it was quite an aristocratic estate, and they were so baffled by it that they got all the witnesses, reverends, police, to write down what they saw. And they would see things like the boy would have shoes on indoors, and they would see the laces untie and go flying across the room, and things like that. And he would, according to all these reports anyway, he would literally disappear in front of their eyes, and they would find him tied up hanging in a tree somewhere.
Okay. We really should have included Josh on this show. He would be loving the fairy stuff.
Oh.
But even some of the poltergeist stuff, it reminds me of things that would be labeled under fairy lore.
Well, yes, because you don't see the poltergeist, do you? You can't see it, so it could be a fairy or a poltergeist. They call it a poltergeist in the accounts. There's one Reverend Phelps in America. I can't remember. It's a famous haunting, and the same thing happened there. The mother used to go into her bedroom, and her clothes would be laid out, but intricately fashioned into the shape of a body. So it looked like. The children used to go in and it looked like her mother was there, but the body wasn't there, but the clothes were made into it. And the son used to be found, again, in a tree. He used to have a rope tied around his neck, and as if he was, going to be killed, hung.
I feel like the poltergeist stuff, though, runs through every type of paranormal encounter. Like, it's there no matter what you're dealing with. There's some level of poltergeist activity, and I think that probably has a combination to do with the area and the people. So some people are more prone to it, and certain areas are more prone to bringing it out of people.
Yeah, it is absolutely fascinating.
So and then it gets its camouflage put on it, depending on where it is and what the belief systems of the time are.
Yeah.
Let's look at the invisible barrier. This is really interesting. This is in Romania.
Give me a second.
That's okay. Sure. It's the portal. Yeah.
Yes. No, sorry. I was just thinking of that Japanese woman's name, and it is Carmen Blacker. But that's what I was checking. Well, yeah. This is really, really strange. A Romanian husband and wife researchers, actually called Capracescu, I believe. They interviewed a man who they would just call EH because he obviously doesn't want to give his identity away. He claims that he had an encounter. He was a retired engineer, and after retiring, he started doing a lot more hiking. And he was staying in a place called the Piatra Mare Seven Stairs Mountains of Romania, and this is in a canyon, and there are literally a set of stairs, wooden and metal, that go up the side of this canyon, and it can get really wet. You're actually warned not to take that route because it can get wet, where the waterfall going down the side of it goes onto the stairs, so it's quite precarious. But he had been hiking one day. He was staying in a lodge there, and he was coming back really with about half an hour walking to get back to the lodge, and he thought, well, I don't want to go back yet, so I'm just going to wander off and see what happens and just take in the area. So he said that he could see this thing glowing in the slight distance. He said it seemed to be something sparkling, as if something was reflecting off the sun. The sun was reflecting off it. Maybe it was a jar or a can. But his curiosity thought, well, I'll go and see what it is. But it was about 30 meters higher than him, so he started to climb up to it. But when he got there, he couldn't see an object. But the thing that was there, he said it was an elliptical, vertical shaped thing. And he said that there was something there because you could see the landscape behind it, but when you looked through it, it was as though you were looking through curved glass. And so the tree behind it he could see, but it looked deformed from as if it was through this vase or glass thing, or almost as if you're looking through gasoline vapor. So he approached it and he thought, well, what is this thing? How is it distorting? And so he picked a branch up, which he said was about, I don't know, maybe a foot or so. And he thought, well, he stuck the branch inside this thing, and he didn't encounter any resistance. It just went straight in. But inside of this elliptical shaped thing, the branch disappeared. You couldn't see it anymore. And when he pulled it back out, some of the branch, the bit that had been inside this thing, had been severed off. So the branch was now half the size it was. And he thought, well, if I'd have put my arm in there, my arm wouldn't have come back. And he repeated it with stone. He tied a stone with some rope and threw it in, and the stone disappeared. So he left some knife markings in the trees around there, and he thought, I'm going to go now. So he went back to the chalet. He was telling the chalet supervisor about it, and he said, well, I've never seen anything like that myself, but, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a new army technology being experimented. And the engineer then saw the chalet supervisor's son, who was 12 years old. And the son said to him, I heard you speak with my dad about this thing you saw. He said, it's the ghost of the woods. And he started listening to the boy, who knew all about this thing. But the boy said, well, there's two phases. When it's transparent, like you saw, it lets things in. And then when it's closed, it's bigger and it's white. And then it's reversed. So nothing can go into it, but things come out. Well, the engineer ended his holiday and went, but he came back, and they looked all around, but they couldn't find it. So he was really disappointed. And that winter, the engineer, he told a friend. And this friend showed him a German magazine that had an article describing this kind of phenomena, and a research group called the Open Doors Research Group. And so this man wrote to them, and he received a long reply back, and they said, well, we've been cataloguing these things for quite some time now. And they gave examples of them, and they said, well, that they have 4 stages: initiation, access, power status, and closing. Phase 2 and 3 don't necessarily occur in that order, he said. They described it as some kind of intense radiation. And they said when it's closed, it's like a gate, and it can be whitish in colour. And again, it doesn't allow us to access it. You can't put things into it, but things can come out. And when they do come out, the research group said they're like white ball shapes that move really, really fast, rolling on the ground. So their observations were that these white object things come out, but what then happens to the white objects? So do they manifest into something, into some kind of entity or monster or something? And so then I thought, well, if we take all of this as real and true, which we don't know, do we? But if we right. say, okay, well, it's definitely, then imagine if you're walking in the woods one day, and then you can't see that there's this elliptical shaped gasoline vapor type thing, and you walk into it, you're not going to come back.
Yeah, that's very true.
But also, what comes out of them?
Yeah. Well, you have the Skinwalker Ranch case where they saw a portal of some kind with werewolf creature like coming out of it. You have the other case that everyone on the show always talks about, and I've never heard the actual conversation about it, but it was a Bigfoot hunter that they saw a portal with things coming out of it. So I mean, there are accounts of stuff like that. And if you look up the Open Door Research Group now, it's a educational government group.
Oh.
That has nothing to do with portals or anything.
Do you mean that they were part of the Skinwalker Ranch? The Open Doors Research Group?
No, I'm saying
sorry.
if you look up Open Doors Research Group right now, it takes you to a bunch of educational sites that have nothing to do with anything paranormal.
Oh, right, yeah.
But yeah, so that might be the other side of a portal. Who knows? I mean, portals are definitely an interesting thing because we really have no concept of where they may go or what may come out of them, if they're even what they seem like they are. And I find it interesting that the kid called it a ghost.
Yeah, I don't know why he said that.
I think it's just we name it or we see it as things that we understand to some degree. Like we may not understand what ghosts are, but if you say ghost to someone, they have a concept of what you're talking about.
True.
And what are you going to call a thing? You know.
That's what I was saying. This thing, in the words, I saw this thing. I know, because you don't know what to call it. Well, I was doing that, wasn't I? I was like, with this thing. Yeah.
Well, now portal is the popular term for it, so, you know. But they're reported here and there, but it's you know, I've never seen any proof they actually exist because like this, they tend to disappear. They're not there for very long, so it's kind of hard to say.
And the people who see them.
Yeah. And it is very possible that someone just walks right through one of these things without knowing they're there and they're never seen again.
That would be terrifying, wouldn't it? Just, oh my goodness. I mean, if it severed the branch, it would literally sever your leg.
Right. Unless maybe it only severed when you try to come back through. You know what I mean? Like if you just walk straight through it, you may not even know you walked somewhere else.
That's true, but all of you would have to go through.
Right. If you stuck your foot through and then tried to pull it back, maybe that's when it would sever your foot off.
Gosh.
One way transit.
Oh, that's terrible, isn't it?
If it's real, if that's
If
what's
it's
happening,
real.
you know.
It's kind of like the animal traps, you know, the old-fashioned animal traps where you step on it. It's got you there, hasn't it? And I kind of see it like that. I mean, it doesn't sever your foot, but it would if you tried to get away from it. And you could,
exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so we're up to the Isle of Mull disappearance.
Okay, this is really quite fascinating. I felt anyway. This was well, he sounds like quite an eccentric character, actually. It's a man called Peter Gibbs. This was, was it in the 70s? He'd been a fighter pilot in World War II, and then he became part of a BBC orchestra. He played for the English and the Scottish BBC orchestras, but he had a private plane as well, so he liked to fly. He also, though, was quite keen on property development. So while he was playing for the orchestras, he started up a business in property. But the summary of the story begins, I suppose, is that he vanished. So he took off one night in a private plane. The plane and him vanished off the Isle of Mull, and then they found his body 4 months later up on a little sort of tiny hill on the island. No sign of the plane, but they'd looked all over that island and past that ground so many times, nobody could work out how on earth he got there. He didn't have a mark on him, and he had no parachute in the plane. So it's really a question of how did he get to where he got to. So,
and the condition of the plane too when they found it.
Yeah. So he. Well, yeah, and really also the fact that they didn't raise the plane up from the seabed to check what happened. But the story is that he, in 1975 at Christmas, he had this plan in mind. He was going to return to Scotland and go to the Isle of Mull, and he wanted to find out if the hotel there, it's a tiny island of just a few miles, he wanted to know the hotel had a private landing strip that could be used only in the summer and spring months because it didn't have any lighting and no air control, ground control, I mean. So you couldn't land in the dark, you couldn't land in winter, but you could in the summer. So he wanted to find out if you could land in the dark in winter, because he wanted to buy a hotel, have a private landing strip next to it, and do that as his business. So he took his girlfriend on Christmas Eve, and they were having dinner in the evening in the hotel, and he was disappointed because he'd heard that a storm was coming in, and he'd really only gone there to fly the plane and land it. And so he thought, well, instead of waiting until tomorrow when the storms come in and I can't fly, I'll go out tonight. And really, it was only going to be a trip of about 3 or 4 minutes. He was going to take the plane up, circle, and see if he could land in the dark. bearing in mind there's no lights to land with. So I said to his girlfriend, well, look, you take a torch, you have a torch in each hand, you stand there and I'll be able to see the torches and I'll be able to land. The owner of the hotel said this is madness, but he just said, look, I was a fighter pilot, it's absolutely fine, I'm not asking for your opinion, I'm going to do it anyway. So he did. He taxied her in the private jet to the end of the land strip, and then he took off into the darkness, and she stood there with the two lights and waited for him, waited for an hour, he didn't come back, and he nor the plane came back. So they began a search across the island, and again, I'm pretty sure it's 8 by 4 miles. It's in the book, so it's not big at all. But they couldn't find him. Everybody on the island looked, and they brought in obviously specialists, but there was no sign of him or the plane. Then fast forward, I believe it's 4 months, and a shepherd is crossing a field, and he sees this man's body as if he's lying against a log. So he's just turned up out of nowhere. The plane hasn't crashed on the island, so the plane must have crashed in the sea. But there were no parachutes on those models. Oh gosh, is it a Cessna? It's one of those old small planes. They didn't come with parachutes, and he didn't have any marks on him. So it looked like he'd been there for quite a while, but they couldn't work out how that was because they'd crossed that ground
right
all the time. His son, some years later, actually decided to retrace the route. So what they thought of was, okay, so he's landed in the sea, he's swum to shore, he's climbed up, and he's gone up to that little hill where he ended up. The bizarre thing was, though, that the hotel was so close to where he was, he would have seen the lights, and he should really have just thought, well, there's the hotel, I can walk on this flat surface back to the hotel. But he didn't. He went further up and he started climbing a hill. Well, he'd have had soaking wet boots and socks and all his clothes on. If it had been, why wouldn't he go straight to the hotel? So his son tried to retrace his steps, and he took his dog, and the son, who was half his age, had to keep stopping because it was so muddy and slippery, and it was also a really exhausting climb. And he gave up on it in the end. He just couldn't do it. And the coroner actually couldn't find any sea salt on him, which doesn't make any sense at all. And the coroner said, well, if he's been there for 4 months, then the wind will have blown all of the sea salt off him. But it wouldn't have done, because on a tiny island, the air is full of... I'm saying, I could be wrong, but I would have thought the air is full of salt on a tiny island in the middle of Scotland. So, and he still had his boots on, so wouldn't the salt still be in his...
You would think so, yeah.
You would think so, wouldn't you? And again, it didn't seem to make sense why he would climb up a hill when he could have seen the hotel and just gone straight there. But more than that, the water was so cold off Scotland that they kind of asked the locals. The locals said, well, if they went out at all in the water, the fishermen, they would wear dry suits, not wetsuits, because it was so cold. The plane was eventually found, they believe, by a couple of fishermen. And it wasn't a mile offshore, it was a little bit less than that, but it still would have seemed a superhuman feat to swim in the ice cold water and then climb to where he got to. But not only that, he would surely have been injured in some way, because he obviously crashed. So how did he crash without getting injured at all? He only had one tiny scratch on him, and managed to swim all that way and then climb up there and then lay where he was. And the coroner said, well, he died where he was found. But that didn't make any sense, because they had definitely... You couldn't really miss him, it was such a tiny island.
Right.
And anyway, there was some bizarre theory. I mean, a local man was reported saying about it, and he said, well, we think that we saw lights in the sky going towards Ireland, and we think maybe he was... doing something with the IRA, and that's where he went. But fair enough, but that doesn't explain how he ended up.
Yeah.
How did he end up where he ended up? Nobody can understand it. Some of the hotel guests, it was actually, because it was Christmas Eve, everybody was drinking and having a good time in the hotel, and they were all quite sort of excited that he was taking off, this daredevil stunt. And although he didn't think it was daredevil, so they, because there were no lights to watch him, they went to the top floor of the hotel, turned out all the lights, and so to try and see him in the dark. And one person said, "Oh no, there was definitely two people out on the landing strip, because we saw the torch, like, let's say for example 500 meters away. One of them was, and the other one was, at a distance. So how could she be carrying both of them at the same time?" But that was never proven. And in fact, to do that, a third person would have had to have got in the plane, taxi to the end of the runway, and then get out, and then she would have seen them. And so there didn't really seem to be a logical way to explain it. I mean, the coroner himself said he was baffled by how it happened. Again, you can find quite good reports actually about it. Where some people are so fascinated, like engineers or pilots, and people have really looked into it, and just nobody can really. I don't know. Maybe there is a really obvious answer. I
don't think there's an obvious answer. I think the very fact that he was there for 4 months without anyone noticing him in an area where he would have been seen or where he's been searched is definitely the oddest part of that. Plus, with the plane being locked, I mean, he would have had to crawl out the front window with, and didn't they say the glass wasn't knocked out completely or whatever?
They did. I mean, I'm not an expert on these kind of planes and things, but I tried to find expert pilots' opinions who all said that he could only have got out through the front screen, which was shattered. But they kind of said, well, yeah, but that would have cut him as he got out. He'd have been in a rush to get up to the surface and not drown, but he didn't have any marks on him. Yeah.
So
but the weird thing as well. Oh, one islander. Sorry, Seriah. One islander said, there's more to this. Not only the IRA thing they were saying, which I don't know. Because the thing is, there was no shady business dealings. Nothing. No idea really that he'd have been smuggling contraband or something. Nobody knew him for that side of that. There was nothing to say that he had that kind of character. Everybody from the orchestras, everybody knew him as a really good person. But one islander said something like, this is really weird, because if they wanted to know what happened, they should have brought the plane up, which is standard procedure, isn't it? You would try and retrieve the plane, but he said they made no effort to get that plane up to find out what happened. So they were saying, there's a lot more that went on that we really know, but I don't know what.
Yeah, it's definitely puzzling. It's one of those things where we clearly don't have all the pieces. Yeah, and we may never have all the pieces.
No, that's true. And I suppose also as well, sometimes with historic accounts, which I guess this was because it's the 70s, you only get pieces of each puzzle, don't you? You don't get every you don't get every piece of it. Although that would be the same if something happened today, you wouldn't know everything about it. So sometimes in these cases, maybe there's something really obvious that you just don't actually know has been found or reported. But I don't know. I like it though. He sounds really good fun because he was quite a daredevil.
Yeah.
So it's really sad that he ended up, that way as well.
All right, so I think we got one left and a few minutes left, so I think we can do this. The disappearance of the transdimensional physicist Phil Kramer.
Yeah, I really like this story as well. He was a bass guitarist for the group Iron Butterfly, who I had
no idea.
No, me neither. I thought you were going to say, "Oh yeah, it was so big." Okay, so it was in 1999. The Washington Post and the newspapers felt he was like a real big star. Okay, well,
I didn't know that he went on to become a physicist. Oh,
you have heard of him then, but you didn't. Oh, okay.
I've heard of Iron Butterfly.
Oh, right, okay. So he was a bass guitarist in the group, but he disappeared and wasn't found for 4 years. And really, I suppose, again, we just don't know really what happened. And the Washington Post wrote about it and said, is Kramer trapped in is he trapped by his own technological wizardry, imprisoned in cyberspace somewhere? And many people believe that when he vanished, he entered another realm. So that's what kind of made me think, oh, this is really interesting. Well, 4 years after he disappeared, his Aerostar van was found at the bottom of a Malibu ravine in a canyon off the Pacific Coast Highway. It was found by a photographer who had a passion for looking for abandoned vehicles, and he had heard that maybe it's a place where people might, dispose of their vehicles. So he'd gone down there, and he came across the vehicle, and that's how they discovered his body was there inside the vehicle. But he has a really interesting backstory. When he was in the band, he was really quite a geek as well, and he, I think, got it from his father, who was a professor, and he then went on to work actually for Northrop Grumman on missile guidance systems, and then set up his own company. But the story, I guess, begins in 95. He had driven to LA Airport. He was now out of the band, and he had his own business. He was going to meet a business colleague, so he'd driven to the airport. He was going to pick them up, but after 40 or so minutes, he just left the airport. He started driving. He stopped after a while, and he made a number of strange phone calls. He phoned a former bandmate called Wombushi and said, "I'll see you on the other side." Then he called the police. He said, "This is Philip Taylor Kramer. I'm going to kill myself, and I want everyone to know O.J. Simpson is innocent. They did it." And then he disappears until his remains are found at the bottom of this canyon. Let me think how to... When he'd been in the band, instead of kind of drinking and things, he used to like to try and solve physics and maths formulas. And his father, who was a professor of engineering at Ohio Uni, he believed that he had come up with this answer to the boundaries of time and space, and he had come up with some kind of formula that produced faster than light communication. The Washington Post said it was way beyond Star Trek, and that really, if the theory held water, then it would be worth billions. And so kind of say, well, maybe this is why his son disappeared, because they were working on this formula. I don't really understand physics, but it was something that meant you could communicate without phones anywhere in the world, that sort of thing. Well, after Kramer left the rock band, he set up a company that it's called fractal data compression for CD-ROMs, some kind of a new technology for it. Well, he had backers, including a brother of Michael Jackson, but the company was really struggling. So they brought in a new backer, or a couple of them, and one of them was a man called Peter Olson, who became the CEO. Well, at the time, he was reading something called the Celestine Prophecy, which I haven't read, but it's supposed to be a book that it asserts if you're enlightened enough, you'll vibrate at such a high frequency that you will literally disappear. So it's very sort of new agey. Well,
oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. This CEO would go around telling the employees at Kramer's company that he was half man, half alien. And it seemed to have an impact on Kramer because Kramer's sister, Kathy, said that her brother then soon begin to say that he was communicating with aliens. But he'd also been working really hard at the time because with the company struggling, his father had said to him, well, you could apply our theory to what you do with your company. And so he had been really spending day and night trying to adapt this theory. And so maybe he just wasn't sleeping and he was working too hard, but he started to say to everybody that he felt he could be in danger, that people were trying to climb over the walls of his and his wife's house, and he said to his wife, people are going to want what I'm working on, we've got to get off the planet. He'd say, I've deciphered the code, it was really encrypted, but I've cracked it. And this was just prior to him going to the LA airport and then just driving off and disappearing. Just before he vanished, he said to his wife that he was not going to see her again on this side. So I guess, in other words, he means I'll see you in heaven. When he disappeared from the airport, he made the phone calls, and then he also stopped off to see his father-in-law, who was terminally ill. And when he was there, he pulled out this small viewing device from his pocket, which actually turned out to be a child's toy. You know those toys that have a lens that fragments and breaks up everything you see?
Yeah.
So
I can't remember what they're called.
Like a kaleidoscope type thing.
Yes, kaleidoscope, yes.
Yeah, I think it was that. And so he was showing his father-in-law this, and then his own father said that after he disappeared, he said, well, his 911 call was actually his coded message to me that he was in trouble. And he said, we'd agreed that this was the call you'd make. But I thought, well, if you made that call to the police, how would his father, like, if there's an emergency, I'm in trouble, wouldn't you phone your parent, even if it was with a code, and say the code rather than phone the police?
Yeah.
And say, so I didn't really get that. But the LA police officer who worked on the case, he said, well, something happened either in his head or at the terminal that made him go on the run. And he said whatever happened to him in his head at the airport was either something playing with his mind or something affecting him from outside of his mind. So he thought it was a bit strange. And there was a sighting or two of him, but well, obviously nothing until he was found at the bottom of this canyon. Right. So I found it a really interesting case because, he thought, oh, I'm being watched, and maybe they're after my physics thing. But maybe he just got completely eccentric. But maybe he was overtired and he was running around making all these calls and he exhausted himself. Or maybe, he really did have something. Maybe he had cracked something. I don't know. It's an interesting case, isn't it? His father apparently doesn't talk about this. About the formula. Is not open to sort of discussing. What it is. But he did make a remark, something like, he said, the weather's being controlled by HARP. So, it's just one of those cases again that you think, well, what really happened and what was going on, and the crazy CEO and.
And was it just paranoid schizophrenia type of thing, or was he really being, hunted by someone?
Yeah, and then he worked for a defense company, and maybe, it was all top secret. I don't know. It could have been that he just exhausted himself, and so no.
All right. Well, we're almost out of time, so let's. All these stories can be found in what book?
I believe this one's People Missing in the Woods.
Okay, yeah, just a small fraction of the stories you have in there.
Yeah, I know. There's a lot in there.
And your books are available on paperback now, right?
They are now, yes. They are.
So if you go to Amazon, you can get a hard copy as well as the digital version.
Yes.
And you're still doing your Patreon.
I am still doing that. I've taken the music away because I know people I didn't like the music. So it's really, my podcast now is really more like an audio book. Kind of like how I'm talking to you. I look at a couple of cases each time, and that's how it is. And some people say, why am I talking so funny? I'm not, I'm just talking. And I think it's because I'm a bit kind of quieter because I'm not interacting with someone. So it's more like an audio book, that's how I do it. I still do it. Yeah. I like it because I don't get nervous doing those, but I get really nervous when I have to do an interview. So.
Well, where is the Patreon? How do people find it?
Well, it's Patreon Steph Young Podcast.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for finally coming back and talking with us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. So we have a short little segment with Steph for patrons. So that will be up sometime later in the week. We're also probably going to put up another sort of special thing from her in the near future for patrons only. So if you want to check this stuff out, become a patron. It's only $3 a month to help us out. Beyond that, if you want to hear her back on the show, go pick up her books. Support her. If you like what you're hearing, it's in the books, and the books are very cheap on Amazon. And there's lots of them. But anyway, we'll see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.